Hello, everyone. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from or when you will be watching the recording. Welcome to this new episode of Screenwriting Studies, the podcast, which is our second episode of 2026. And today I am delighted to introduce our special guest, who is an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen, an esteemed colleague, and let me say, good friend, Eva Novrup Redvall. Eva is the author of Writing and Producing Television Drama in Denmark, From the Kingdom to the Killing, and more recently, Writing and Producing for Children and Young Audiences, cases from Danish film and television, which won deservedly the SRN Award for Best Monograph in 2025 last year. Besides that, she's also one of the editors for the book series Studies in Screenwriting for Palgrave Macmillan and serves on the editorial board on the Journal of Screenwriting. Eva, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Paolo.
We will, of course, talk about your chapter in the Handbook of Screenwriting Studies, but can we start with some background, especially for those who might not be familiar with your work? I mentioned the titles of your two books, which kind of summarize the arc, so to speak, of your main research interests in the last couple of decades, so to speak. When you and I first met, which is now quite a long time ago, we were two of very few scholars who studied writing for TV drama, and then subsequently you turned your attention to writing for children and young audiences. So could you tell us a little bit about this evolution in your research?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you very much for this invitation. I mean, it's an amazing handbook you've made, edited, and I think this is an excellent idea of having these conversations. And also, everything going on in the Screenwriting Research Network means a lot to me because that's where it all started, Paolo, basically. Because when I was a PhD student, I was writing a thesis about screenwriting collaborations between directors and screenwriting at the University of Copenhagen. And I felt that almost no one in Denmark was interested in screenwriting. They were like, what are you doing? And this thing, production studies, what is that anyway? And then I saw on some website that there was this conference in Leeds and somebody starting a screenwriting research network for people with an interest in this. And I was a PhD student and I asked, can I come, please? And I was allowed to come, and that was really a great experience. And finding out that we are so many scholars around the world with a shared interest, and it's been so productive having these conversations for so many years. So, I mean, then I organized the conference, and the Journal of Screenwriting started, and the book series came along, and it's just been such an amazing journey with this network. But that was actually that's where it started for me. I was really interested in screenwriting collaborations between directors and screenwriters. And my thesis pointed to how, in the Danish context, the director is very much considered the artist in the auteur tradition. And the screenwriter is more sort of the craftsperson, making the vision of the director come alive. And then I was curious about what does this look like in television? Because at that point, Danish TV series were very popular in Denmark. Nobody else was watching, and we never thought that anyone else would take an interest. But I was very curious because I could see that the mode of writing was so different. Having writers' rooms, having to learn how to collaborate in that kind of environment, and having head writers and episode writers, and having to learn how to work like that. So that's what I turned my attention to, and that's where we started talking also about television writing, and it was great that you were also interested. And since then, of course, with the explosion of streaming and the interest in Danish TV series and series from all over the world, so much has happened in this field in terms of studying writers' rooms and showrunners and collaborations and serial storytelling and all of this. So that's been really interesting. So, I mean, that book about writing for Danish television really came out of the network because it was Ian MacDonald encouraging me to write about it. And I was like, nobody is interested internationally. And he was like, yes, I think so. You should probably write it as an English book and not just as a Danish book. And I did that. And I've been really, amazed and honored to see that there has been an interest in what has been going on in this small nation film and television culture. But of course, it's always a question of what travels and what interests other people. And that's where there's not a lot of focus on children and young audiences for so many reasons, because this content rarely travels. For reasons of language and subtitles and everything else. So I turned to that because I thought we were really overlooking that. So that's where I kind of moved from writing television for adults and ordinary audiences to saying, why don't we look at what's happening over here for children and young audiences? Because I think it's really important and really, really interesting. So that's kind of how I ended up over there.
Yeah. And screenwriting for children and young audiences is in fact the title of your chapter in the handbook, and I have it here, the handbook. And but you structure your chapter around defining or trying to define your topic based on three prepositions. So this is a triple question if you want, because these three prepositions are writing for children and young audiences, about and with children and young audiences. So could you tell us a little bit about each of these defining strategies and why it's important to make these distinctions?
Yeah, I mean, I moved into the field of children and young audiences with great respect because a lot of stuff has been written about children's films. A little has been written about children's television, for instance, by Australian scholar Anna Potter, Janet Stevens, and others. And a lot of stuff has been written about children and children's development and all this stuff. But there's very little on screenwriting for children. When I started looking into this, and I was really surprised to find that there's so little. And of course, that's because when you say children's content or screenwriting for children, it's only saying something about a target audience. It's really only saying that you're targeting a specific demographic, and you can tell stories for children in all kinds of genres. It can be comedy, it can be drama, it can be all sorts of things. But I could only find like one book basically at that point, and something on writing for teenagers. But there's a lot of stuff on writing for children's literature, for instance, or picture books. And some of these ideas are similar in terms of what can you tell to children, what interests children. But it is a challenge, of course, if you want to say anything about screenwriting for children, that it can be in so many different genres and from so many different perspectives. So when I moved into this field, I started thinking about what's going on. I was looking at what practitioners do, which is always what interests me. I'm not a screenwriter myself, so I'm really interested in studying the collaborations and the processes and what practitioners are doing and thinking. And I could see that there was a difference between whether you are writing something for children, so you are specifically targeting this audience. And we can talk a lot more about segmentation and how children is a very broad audience and children are very different across the world, not the least. And then there was writing about children. So you can tell stories about children that are not necessarily for children, but lots of wonderful stories are made about children. And there are these different modes, you can say, of engagement that a scholar like Noel Brown in the field of children's film has been writing a lot about. And then what I could see happening in the Danish context was that there was a lot more screenwriting suddenly going on, or at least production with children. So trying to involve children into the process of actually making content for them. And that turned out to be something that we focused a lot on. And when I say we, it's because I got money for a research project from the Danish Research Council. So we've been a group of scholars in a project called Reaching Young Audiences that have focused on this. And what was very interesting to see was what I ended up calling inquiry-driven screenwriting, sort of really trying to learn a lot about children before writing for them, and also working with co-creative strategies, so trying to involve them in the process. So the chapter is structured around that, first saying something, what's particular about thinking about children in terms of screenwriting, and why is so little written about this, because it's so important and so interesting. And then trying to focus on the writing for children, about children, and with children. Um, so later I got to write the whole monograph where I could, of course, expand this on this in a whole different way. But that was my
The, you,
attempt
you,
to keep it focused for the handbook.
you were saying there was little about writing for children and young audiences, but what was the literature that was available? Was it more about reception? Was it more about production? How was the landscape?
Well, I was looking specifically like if there were any how-to books, for instance, like manuals, how to write a children's film, how to write a children's television. And there's very little in this. There might be something that I haven't found, definitely. And there's also a lot of stuff that has happened recently. For instance, in Denmark, what has happened while we've had the research project is that there's now a whole new school called the Cross Media School for Children's Fiction.
Oh yeah.
And the idea is that you have a story and you have an interest in telling something to children, and then you find out the cross media element. Is this best suited for theater or literature or film or TV or maybe cross media? And or maybe I have an IP that could work across all these different art forms. And that has been a school that has emerged because there was this sense that nobody was taught how to write for children, particularly in film and television. At the film school, for instance, there was no interest in this. And there's been this sense that because we've all been children once, we all know what it's like to be a child, and thus we can just, find our inner child and know how to tell a story for children. And there's been a very clear realization that this is not necessarily the case, and that it's something particular. And I think the Cross Media School of Children's Fiction here now takes that very seriously. And it's very interesting to follow their work and how they're now trying to think about and also maybe publish, hopefully, a little about what is particular about this kind of writing.
You
So
mentioned this project that was funded by the Danish Research Council that went on for quite a few years, and as part of your project, which yes culminated with the publication of your monograph, but you also organized a number of symposia, and I remember because I attended the conference, I think it was the last conference that you organized in Copenhagen a couple of years
yeah,
ago.
the closing
And I
conference
remember
of the
the
project.
people, yeah, I remember somebody from the Cross Media School was in attendance too at that conference.
Yeah.
That conference was fascinating in the way that it highlighted different cultural sensibilities and approaches too between Denmark and other countries. And that includes both the actual content output in the various countries, as well as the academic output and the attention devoted to the public in general. So what are your thoughts about those differences, similarities and differences of these different cultural sensibilities and approaches?
Well, I mean, the conference was amazing in the sense that it brought together scholars from all over the world. And then, I mean, also collaborators like Anna Potter talking from the Australian perspective, Jeanette Demas from the UK perspective, American scholars. But for instance, Ruchi Kirjagi working on children's television a lot from India. And you go, it's mind blowing. I mean, in Denmark, we're 6 million people and we have this public service television culture. We have quite a lot of funding for children's films. So actually 25% of the production support from the Danish Film Institute is earmarked for children and young audiences. And then you hear Ruchi talking about the Indian context and the number of children and the media system. And it's just fascinating. Um, Also, we had Yuval Gosansky from Israel zooming in, and he's been editing a book on children's television around the world, which is also absolutely fascinating because there are so many different perspectives and so many different ways of growing up, and the kind of access that children have to content in different parts of the world is so different. So I think in that way, for me, and also for the Danish industry participants, that was really amazing with the conference. But I think maybe you're asking about how we actually have a relation to the industry in our research also, or
I remember, yes, actually, one thing that was also fascinating was the participation of people from the industry. And this is something that actually always resonated with me when reading about your work, because it was also your first book. You actually, I think that you shadowed people in the writer's room at the DR, right? And I remember that at the conference, the contribution of, I think it was the DR's head of strategy for children and young audiences.
yeah.
So there seems to be this kind of will to collaborate between industry and academia as well, and research, and they too also run research projects. So is this something that how much did you rely on that, and how could you rely on that? How much do you think that you could rely on that kind of collaboration? Because that is not always the case elsewhere, and so I think that impressed me a lot because you mentioned, I think the various age brackets, and the DR seem to have a very specific strategy for each age bracket, very specific policies, very specific editorial approaches. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great privilege to be doing these kinds of studies from a small nation like Denmark, where we have this strong public funding, and I think that gives a lot of the industry practitioners a sense of allowing for transparency and wanting to give something back. And also, we do have collaborations in place, so they have been partners in the research project from the outset. And I think in the children and young audiences case, it was also because they were sincerely curious about what's going on. What can we learn about children? How can we get better at making content in Danish for children and young audiences in the current media landscape? Because there are many challenges that we could definitely talk about later. So I think in the case of my early work on television drama, I was lucky because there was the sense that things were going well. That Danish TV series had momentum and they were onto something. And in that case, it wasn't very dangerous to allow me into the writers' rooms to sort of document a success story, something that was working very well. I think that has changed a lot, not necessarily because things are going bad, but just because of the whole way that streaming has changed the setup and everything has become much more competitive. So my Norwegian colleague Vilde Skanke Sonne has, for instance, been writing about, I mean, the hardships of getting access. That she's written a wonderful book and had access in the Norwegian public service broadcasting system, but it's just getting harder to do these kinds of studies. But because children and young audiences is less high profile and people are not used to being asked and being in the limelight to the same extent, I think people are very open to collaborating and also very interested in what they might actually learn from us as researchers. So that has been a great privilege because there's been this industry interest all the way through. In terms of media research, like what are children watching and what can we learn and could we do some more qualitative studies of this, but also in terms of the screenwriting and production studies. And they participated in the conference, these collaborators, and also were part of panels. And I think it's very, very fruitful to have these kinds of collaborations.
Certainly, one of the things that you must have had to take into account is the fact that, of course, you mentioned it before, the transition to new kind of distributions, the online mediascape, and the different types of consumption, and of course, for an adult audience, it's more intuitive to think how this might have happened. How is that for children? Because of course, for children, accessing this kind of media is different compared to adults. So did you have to take that into account?
Definitely. We had three work packages in the Reaching Young Audiences project. So mine is kind of the screenwriting and production studies, and I had a PhD who did a thesis on co-creation specifically when making children's content. But we also had a work package on commissioners and what commissioners think about children and childhoods, which is of course important because as a screenwriter, when you're pitching an idea, as I also address in the chapter, you will always be met about what is appropriate content for children. There are very specific ideas about what is appropriate at any given point in time. And sort of the third work package was then looking into what are children actually watching and how are they thinking about quality and relevance. So we were sort of looking at commissioners, what do they think should be produced, and then doing the screenwriting and production studies, how is this then produced, and then looking at what are children actually watching it. And what are they thinking about the content that is being produced for them? And they might be watching something completely different. And spoiler alert, often they are. So it's very complicated now compared to when I grew up, and there was a Danish television, and you would turn it on, and that would be the children's program of the day. And when they changed the timing, the scheduling of the children's program, all Danish families had to change the time when they eat dinner because it structured the day, and that was what was available. And cut to now where it's so different and the competition is fierce, which is also, of course, why the industry was more eager to talk to us. Like, what can we learn in terms of how to up our game and reach an audience that is getting still harder to reach because of social media, gaming, etc. It's not only competing film and television, it's all the other things that children now have on screens available to them all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah.
In the book, you mentioned, I think it's in the introduction, to dramaturgical models, basically the classical whale model
Yeah.
is now challenged by the dragon model. Can we talk a little
Yes.
bit about those two models?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, already in the 1970s, we had this legendary head of the Children and Youth Department at the Danish Broadcasting Company who said that children and young audiences are the worst audience at all because they are so impatient. And if they don't like what they're seeing, there's just no mercy. They won't be sitting there politely watching. They'll just go, oh, this is bad, and they will go do something else. But I mean, when I grew up, you could then just turn off the TV and do something else. You couldn't just choose a lot of other content. So that is what is happening now to a very large degree that you have to compete. I think I forgot your question there when I went down the 70s road. But what was your question again, Paolo?
The two models, the
Ah, yeah,
werewolf
the
model
dramaturg.
and the
Yeah.
dragon. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean in classical dramaturgy you have like the whale model and you can slowly build and hope that the audience will come along for the journey. And what they find in streaming and definitely for many of the younger audience members is that they're very impatient and you have to hook them up front. So they have developed these new dramaturgical models for certain content where it's like wow, an explosion at front to hook people in and building, 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 and again ending on a climax to make sure that you want to see the next episode and you stay tuned. So it's a different way of thinking that you have very, very little time to introduce a story and character. You basically open with something very exciting and then you can build in a different way. So this is the dragon model that I write a little bit about in the book and mention in the chapter.
Okay. I'll ask you one more question, and then we'll see whether Klaus and Rosamund have other questions. The one thing that I was really interested in was this, the subdivision in the various age brackets that the DR, the Danish broadcaster, does. Because of course we all know, the preschoolers and the early schoolers, 4 to 8 years old, and then the preteens and the early teens, etc. But they also have a younger bracket, which goes from 1 to 3. I think it's the Smallborn. I don't forgive me.
Mini Shang for
Yeah,
toddler.
forgive me for
Yeah,
butchering the Danish pronunciation. So, how
yeah.
did you find any? Because you mentioned you were looking for how-to guides on how to write for children. How does one write for 1 to 2 years old and 3 years old or 3 years old?
Yeah.
And what
And so,
are the DR recommendations or the DR approaches to this age bracket?
yeah. I mean, we talk about children and young audiences, but that's such a
Yeah.
broad category, and there are so many segments within that, and that has been something that, at least in the Danish industry, there's been a lot more focus on lately. So yes, for instance, the Danish broadcaster now they have the mini shang for toddlers, 1 to 3 year olds. They have rammeshang for the preschoolers and the children starting school, 4 to 8 year olds, and then they have DR Ultra for the 9 to 14 year olds. And of course, doing productions for these different age groups is very, very different. And I was really curious to see, for instance, if you can tell a story with a beginning and middle and end, a fiction story for 1 to 3 year olds, and looking for good cases there. And you can. And if you're ever feeling depressed, and I think even though it's in Danish, you should just put on an episode of Little Tiger that I cover in my book. I'm not sure I mentioned it in the chapter, but that is a production that I then tell sort of the evolution story of. And there's so many ideas about what you can tell and how to tell it, going into basically telling a story about a new child every time dressed in a tiger costume who sees an adult doing something. The adult leaves the room, normally because the phone is ringing, and the adult gets distracted. And then the child wants to do this on their own and tries it out. And of course, things get messy or go a little wrong. But it's all okay, and at the end, the adult comes back and reassures that there's no scolding. It's fine, but it's a big drama for the small children, and it's been tested throughout production, and you can see these toddlers going, oh, they already know at that age that, oh no, you're not supposed to do that, and it's a big drama, and yet it's also very fun. And the intention was to do comedy for children with that program, as I trace in the book. And again, trying to all these strategies for how long can you tell something for that age group? How can you sort of get them to watch by opening with animation and then, oops, it's live action. And it's actually watching a child like you. And then, yeah, lots of different ideas going into something that looks so simple and has taken actually a lot of time to write and develop.
It
So
seems to
in
have.
my book, I cover productions for the different age groups, which is really interesting. And in the chapter, I mostly focus on this production, The Class, which is set in an ordinary Danish school of sixth graders, so around 12 years old. And it's a big success story in Denmark. It's now more than 1,000 episodes have been produced. So it's the Danish TV series with the most episodes ever. And it's because it's a very simple setup, affordable fiction as they discuss it. And it's about the everyday lives of children. So there's a lot of identification and it's quite cheap to produce. But when you trace the screenwriting apparatus about that, it's also crazy. They produce 8 scripts a week. It's and it's a completely crazy speed and all the considerations about then how can you make a production, an highly efficient production framework that works has been very interesting to explore. And then I write a little bit about the COVID-19 Jonas Risvig series Centrum, which is an example of then working with children, involving children.
Yeah, I
So
will ask you more about working with children, but let's see if Klaus and Rosamund have questions.
I did actually want to ask if you would talk a bit more about collaboration and co-creation with children and young people and some of the kind of key aspects that you've been kind of looking at with your research.
yeah, oh, it's when we started looking into this, what we found was that DR was talking about having junior editors. So having children who actually got a credit and were involved in the process of screenwriting and production. So, and that was, for instance, on a series like The Class, where you want to make sure that you're really close to children and what's happening in an ordinary school right now, because it really it's produced so quickly and it has to capture what's going on at that very moment in time. And we thought that was very fascinating. I mean, and who gets invited and how does that work? And do they know how to write screenplays? How do you get that input? So my PhD student Katrine Buschinger Christensen, who wrote this thesis on co-creation, and I have been focusing quite a bit on that. And it's very interesting in the way that screenwriters really appreciate the input. Um, and that but often they will get the input filtered through a person in the production framework who will be the one who's actually in touch with children and will sit around a table and listen to what the children are saying and then kind of filter the insights to the creatives who can then pick and choose, but now they at least know what the response of children was. So that's one way of doing it, and they might also look at edits and be involved in different ways. And then the Jonas Risvig way of working in the series that he developed under the COVID-19 pandemic, that was much more saying, and also an older age group saying, there's a pandemic. I want to tell a story about this. What's it like? The Danish schools closed during the pandemic. So what's it like living through a pandemic and not going to school and not knowing what's happening in the world? And he basically sent out an invitation for young people to collaborate. I want to know what is it like? Help me write about this. So that was a very sort of open invitation to storylines, characters, muse, as a bit inspired by what Julia Andem did with the Norwegian series Skam. I mean, wanting to tell about a very specific time and young people, and then really insisting that then I need to have input from them. So, but it's of course always being structured, and it's always a matter of the creative practitioner making the final choices. So when you talk about co-creation and different theories about co-creation, you can definitely challenge whether what is going on is true co-creation in terms of the theories around this, or whether it's more inviting children to contribute in a different way. I choose to call it inquiry driven sort of screenwriting, because you are curious about something. It's not just desktop research, it's really involving the people you want to tell something about and you want to tell something to into the process, because you're very curious about who they are and what they think. Um, but there's a lot to discuss in terms of whether it's true co-creation, for instance, theoretically.
Yeah,
And I know you have an upcoming book on this topic. So I think, when that gets out, we will get into very detailed discussions about this.
yes, yes.
Yeah,
And indeed, you're contributing to that book.
yeah.
Yeah, so it is a kind of an area very very close to my heart, and I wondered if, yeah, I suppose if you would sort of see, like, so you gave so those examples of particular case studies, but I wonder, like, whether you think that this is something that is, in the new landscape that you're talking about, that is emerging now, like, is it something that is becoming a more widespread model, or there are actually issues in the current landscape that are maybe, moving against that model, this kind of idea of co-creation? Is it becoming, you know, more embedded? Are people trying to explore further approaches, different approaches, more fully developed kind of equal co-creation, or is it moving the other way? Are there things that are actually maybe presenting obstacles?
I think there are many obstacles to that, and there's a lot to discuss in terms of the power dynamics as well. And it takes time and it costs money.
Yeah.
And I attended an event at the Danish Broadcasting Corporation where they presented this way of working, because they've kind of been insisting that if you pitch something to them, you should have a junior editor attached. They want to make sure that the children's perspective is in there in one way or another, but it doesn't necessarily have to be co-creation. And as several industry people were like, yeah, but that's time consuming and that costs money. And it's different for you as a big broadcaster who can have a whole children's panel and who can have a person in charge of this working with it in a very structured way. So I think also because the content that, for instance, the Danish Broadcasting Corporation is currently focusing on is more high end. It's less obvious to work with those kinds of methods. If you're doing the class, trying to portray everyday life in a school class right now, it makes excellent sense in very many ways. But now the talk is to produce volcano productions, big productions that erupt and they're visible in the mediascape. Nobody can miss it. It makes a lot of noise and everyone wants to see it. And if that's what you want to do, then you're in a whole different area, production wise, production value wise, and dramaturgically. And that's not as well suited, I would say, to work with those kinds of methods. So it might also have been a moment in time where there was a lot of focus on this in the Danish context, and everyone was talking about co-creation because it felt like this is how we attract the young audiences, and because everyone was very inspired by the work of Julia Endem on the Norwegian series Skam. So even though that was more research based, you could say doing really extensive research into the target audience, which was 16-year-old Norwegian girls, based on the NABC model of trying to find out what is their needs and how can I make something that talks into that. Yeah, I think in a way it might have been a very specific moment in time but I think the Danish industry has at least learned a lot of lessons about the value of knowing a lot about your audience. Whether you then co-create is a different matter, but at least having detailed knowledge about if I'm targeting toddlers or preschoolers or teens, tweens, whatever, what is going on right now and what are they watching, what are they interested in, all that stuff. I think is now considered very valuable in a way where there was a lot more skepticism previously among screenwriters also, that why do I have to need that? I have something I want to tell. I know what it's like to be a child. So I think in that way it is a different state of mind, but I don't think we see a lot of co-creative productions at the moment.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah.
Eva, you mentioned Scum and then the class, and there's, of course, there's been quite some exchanges between the various Scandinavian countries, right? With between these series, and then one making, the I think that Sweden has sort of done their own version of the class, if I'm correct, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly. Has there been more? Is this something that's still ongoing? Is this something that will go on in the future? Is this become a trend in Scandinavian countries?
And there is a very strong a collaboration between the Nordic countries. And it's, I mean, I think it's 1959 that Nordvision was established in broadcasting. So that was like a program exchange setup, but there's also a lot of co-production meetings, and it's in all kinds of genres of television. The Nordic Film and TV Fund is very influential in terms of also encouraging and facilitating collaborations in the area of film. And there's been a lot of focus on children and young audiences lately. So, I mean, there is a good structure and a big network for collaborating across the Nordics. Sometimes things can travel, but because we also have different languages, it can be hard for children, and depending on the age. So sometimes you will remake it. And for instance, in the case of The Class, they decided in Norway and Sweden to do their own versions because our school systems are also different. And it had to be so close to what's going on among 12-year-olds in their countries that it was easier or better to do their own versions. Then they can, of course, be inspired by existing screenplays and episodes, but they will also write their own. But there is in the Nordic countries also a shared sense of how to address children and of what you can tell to children. And it's been interesting in this project, which is, of course, also of relevance to screenwriting, to feel how there's a big difference also between like Denmark and the UK or Denmark and France. When I've been hearing and talking to people about some of the Danish series and what we will actually allow, and also some pretty dark humor, and ideas about children as quite independent and able to watch also quite challenging content sometimes.
Yeah, the BBC's notion of good content in the UK, which is of course open to interpretation, and I was thinking now that you were talking about it, about the openness in the Scandinavian countries, that I remember at the conference talking about John Dillermand, which
Yeah.
was it was very fun, yeah, and I was
Yeah.
wondering when maybe or where in what other countries there will be something similar, yeah.
Yeah, well, I attended a children's media conference. We would go every year where the industry meets, and they had people from the BBC coming. And before they did their presentation, there had been clips from this quite outrageous Danish series, and it was people were dying all over the place, and it was just fun and games. And then the BBC came and say, "Oh no, no, you can't say poo on British TV," and everyone was just laughing because what if they had seen what had come before? That was quite a contrast. And that's been kind of also the joy of doing this project, that we've had all these international encounters on the way. And I have to give credit to critical studies in television. And unfortunately, I just learned that they're closing down the blog, because we had a wonderful collaboration with them where we were able to do blogs on our research project. I think we did like 25 different blogs. And we could write about, for instance, the Children's Media Conference, the meeting between the Danish and the UK industry, or we could write about John Dillermand when that was happening and suddenly made news in the UK, or made headlines in the UK. And we could cover what's going on during the pandemic. And it's wonderful with a handbook like yours. It's amazing, but it takes a long time to publish a book like that. So if you really want to catch if things are moving really fast in children and your content for children and young audiences, so sometimes it was just wonderful to be able to write a blog and then feel that you were having a dialogue with international colleagues. So I'm very sad to see that closing, but I know that they've put so much hard work into that, and it's hard to keep up.
Can we go back to the particulars of writing for
Yeah.
children? What are the main learnings from the project? What do you have to consider if you're writing? And in addition to that, if you see development like the Dragon model also, can you detect or study some tendencies in children, in media for children, that soon will become a tendency in mass media for everyone? Because when they are growing up, and they are growing up soon, as starting with Big Bang is not just happening in children's media.
No, no. But I would say, first of all, of course, there's a big difference between writing film and television. So a lot of the stuff I've been writing about has been television, and that's a different beast. So there's a lot of still traditional storytelling in film and also in a lot of television, but it's those short formats, the short streaming formats that have dramatically changed. And I think just going to the future thing first, maybe. I think that's something that we're discussing at least here a lot. That what happened to the short film? Actually, the short film is very suited for the digital mediascape. And for instance, the funding at the Danish Film Institute almost disappeared after many years of having a proud short film tradition. So I think the short formats hopefully will get more attention. So it's also making very ambitious and short films for children, also maybe for cinemas and not only for the digital, because the attention span is an issue. And if you look at all the research now, I talk about in my book the audience exploration turn, because there's been all this data coming on what are they watching and what do they like, and what do they think about genre and characters and storylines. And there is an impatience and there is a sense that a film is very, very long. So, and how do you address that as a screenwriter if you want to if you want to write a film? So I think as in that sense, film and television are very different things. But I think across that, there are many things to consider as a writer, of course. First of all, exactly who are you targeting age-wise? Or is it a family film? Noel Brown, for instance, has done a lot of wonderful research on family films in different contexts. And he's also been writing about this sense of address. Like, are you writing with a single address, only addressing children? Are you writing with a dual address, sort of appealing to both? Are you writing with an undifferentiated address where it works for children and adults in the same way? And those are kind of things that you have to consider in a different way when writing for children in terms of audience. What you can then write, I think, can take on a lot of different shapes and be told in very many different ways. And I think there's still a lot of wonderful children's films out there. What we've seen in the Danish context was that it was very hard for writers to get sort of the traditional children's film financed because the domestic audience is so small. And a lot of the funding instead was used for animated films or for family films and family franchises. But in the past 2 years, we've seen a new focus sort of insisting that we need to make live action and also animation for toddlers. So I think a lot of new writers are seeing opportunities here and writing really, really interesting things. But I do think it can look in so many different ways. So it's very hard to generalize. Um, yeah, not sure whether that answered your question, but yeah.
Yeah, mostly. But can I add one question, because it
Yeah.
really is there no discussion about the 1 to 3 year olds
Yeah.
about should we
Should
do
they be
this
watching
at
screens
all?
at all?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
This happened just when DR launched Mini Shang. And their argument was that we know that this demographic is watching screens. So if they are watching screens, we should offer quality content. We should offer it on a platform where we're not encouraging more viewing. It's about quality and not quantity. It's not about pushing a lot more content. It's about making content that encourages play and playfulness and learning and all these things. So they have a whole Mini Shang manifesto that is online and that is quite cute, and that I've also published in my monograph. So, but just when they launched Mini Shang, those discussions exploded. Like, should children of that age be watching screens at all? And that is a big thing, and it's a relevant discussion to be had. But I think it's very much about what are they watching and how much are they watching. And I think you have to kind of focus on that, saying it's not necessarily all bad, but it's a question of how much screen time and what is going on that screen. And that's basically where we are at the moment. So the Mini Shang is very popular. And it feels like those productions are at a speed and sort of storytelling wise in a way that toddlers can cope with and be inspired to go out into the world and explore with. But it's a very relevant question, Klaus, definitely.
Thanks.
We just had the first feature film also targeting the younger. Yeah. So trying to teach children to go to the cinema, which is also a big thing here now, that they're not going to the cinema very much, and there hasn't been very many films for the youngest audiences. So how do you sort of teach children to actually watch films in a cinema?
I just wanted to ask, so you began by talking about how you moved from your sort of interest in television drama and collaboration between director and screenwriter, and then moving into this area of children's, writing for children. And I'm wondering, are you now moving on to a different research
That's
area?
a very good question, Rosamund. I must say it's been wonderful studying children and young audiences, but it's also really stressful because it's such a moving target. And it's also like I'm not on TikTok, and a lot of stuff that's going on right now is on TikTok. I have a colleague in Aarhus, University of Aarhus, a PhD student, and she did a thesis, just defending her thesis on TikTok. And I asked her, "Is there any fiction on TikTok? You like, and is there what's it like? And can you come do a lecture for my students because I'm not on TikTok?" And she was like, "Oh, I can't find any fiction on TikTok." And then suddenly it exploded with all these micro series and everything, which is really fascinating, but it's also very stressful to watch, fiction that I have these clips I now show my students of episodes of 1 minute. Or many Australian series, they started early in Australia with these short formats in online, different online formats, but it's the whole vertical horizontal thing as well. And I think if you want to focus on this, you have to be interested in what's going on in social media, what's going on the new platforms. I'm not sure I have the energy for that. Of course, I could just, continue focusing on children's film, and I will follow this definitely for sure. But I think if you are to be an expert in this area, you really, really need to engage with what's going on those screens. And that means really watching a lot of that stuff yourself. And I'm not sure I'm the right person. I'm trying to get my students to take an interest. I'm looking at them going, you are supposed to do this now because you are much closer in age and media use, and we need experts in this. So yeah, I'm definitely going to focus on this also, but I'm also having some new ideas about where to go now. So an obsession of mine at the moment is failure studies and untold film stories, and looking at things that are not produced and why, and how to understand that and what to learn from that, and yeah, all those discussions around development and note giving, and why something is made or not made. So I have a lot of curiosity there at the moment, and I'm much more eager to do that than to watch a lot of TikTok. So so that's maybe the sad answer. But I think screenwriting wise, there's still so much work to be done. I would love to see somebody write from the practitioner perspective a book on how to write for children and young audiences, because I've come very much to this, of course, from the analytical perspective and trying to describe what other people are doing. And I think there's definitely value in that. And I hope the chapter in the handbook is useful also, of course, for writers. But I think there's a lot to explore from a practitioner perspective as well as an academic perspective. But can we get the young generation to do that? Upcoming scholars, we need passionate about TikTok and all sorts of new platforms.
Well, we'll have quite a lot of new people at the conference in September, hopefully. So maybe that's when we can have that discussion.
I must say, I also attended a television conference in Bologna
Mhm.
in September where there was a lot of interesting presentations
Yeah.
on microseries. So,
Yeah.
so there is a lot happening, and also in Asia. I mean, it's such a huge
Yeah,
market, and
especially Asia, North America. Yes, it's
yeah. So I do think there are researchers taking an interest, not necessarily from the children's perspective, but definitely in these new online formats. So
well, we'll have stuff to discuss in September when we meet.
definitely. definitely.
Yeah, I started to watch vertical drama as well, but I'm not sure it's for me as well. Yeah, so
It's a bit stressful. Maybe we're just too
it's
old
not
powder.
stressful. It's just I mean, and I get it, and it's the format, the 1 minute thing. I mean, for me, 1 minute is nothing. I'm not even started, but it's as you say, it's the threshold of attention and the attention that you need to capture in just that 1 minute to make sure that they're gonna watch the next minute or so. So it's reached that kind of extreme in terms of attracting an audience and make them loyal to watch the next one and then the next one. Yeah, so
Yeah.
and it's
And
just the
I
way it
and
is.
I think in terms of screenwriting, Klaus, it might have consequences for pace and understandings of backstory. For instance, I have one of these 1 minute episodes from TikTok that I show is an episode where these young people wake up on a beach and then you understand they've had a party. Somebody they have been very drunk and somebody has disappeared. Apparently he has died, and you are now at the funeral. End of episode. All this happens in 1 minute. And a Danish drama series could easily have taken an hour to tell this. I mean, it's very dramatic, and who are these characters, and what? So it's just, yeah, it's a whole different ball game, and it's very fascinating. But it's definitely also a completely different kind of writing. So also, I mean, there's a lot to explore, not only for children and young audiences, but just focusing on those very, very short formats.
Interesting. Short form keeps reappearing. It
Yeah.
keeps being a focus, and then that particular sort of short form that has been the focus seems to kind of disappear, but then a new form comes, and so it's a constantly reinventing itself.
And the extreme serialization, which is also very interesting. I mean, compared to the one-off short film, so it's fascinating.
Just to inform everybody that the next episode of Screenwriting Studies, the podcast, will be sometime in late May or early June, and our special guest next time will be none other than Ian MacDonald. And as usual, we will post the details via mailing lists and social media in the coming weeks. So I'm going to draw this episode to a close now, but not before thanking Eva for being with us today and sharing your expertise and insight with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for editing a great handbook.
Well, thank you for contributing to it.